Plants vs. Zombies was set to be one of the biggest video games in the world. Not only was the file size over a gigabyte on my 10-year-old phone, but the game actually sold well too. Well enough to justify a comic line, a sequel, multiple spin-offs, and even an actually good comic line. Brains, chocolate pizza, ooh. What you probably haven't heard much about is the newest installment in the series, Plants vs. Zombies 3, which you can already play if you don't live somewhere important. So why is nobody talking about it? The short answer is a complete lack of interest from both the public and the publisher. The long answer is somewhere in this Dannerade video. Still, not everyone has an attention span for a new documentary every time a game update drops, so stick with me for the quick answers and lack of Gatorade puns. The first Plants vs. Zombies game was published by PopCap Games in 2009. On the surface, it was fairly unremarkable. Zombies would spawn from the right side of the screen, and if they made it to the left, you would lose. To stop them, players could choose from a collection of plants that each had unique abilities, ranging from shooting them to shooting them alive. This was fairly typical for the tower defense genre. In fact, you could probably describe most of these games just by switching up the words between verses. Gems vs. zombies, math vs. abstract concepts, balloons versus my frame rate. Oh my PC. Hell, this is so easy I could do it myself. Let's do YouTubers versus... unexpected, but not unrealistic. What made PvZ so different is how they approached enemy management. In all the previous examples, there's one long track that every enemy would go down in a single file line. It didn't really matter where you placed anything on that track since, just like my own experience on the team, they'd hit every obstacle on their way to the end. This led to two main problems: a lack of complex strategy, and a lot of these games feeling samey. It's also worth noting that since a lot of these games have short breaks between waves rather than levels, once you build up a strong enough defense, you kind of just sit there watching the game play itself, like Minecraft Story Mode or the worst kind of people on Overwatch.
Please, me, I need this!
Instead of falling into the same flaws of the genre, PvZ innovated, most notably by using the same strategy I employ when swimming without goggles, using 5 lanes instead of 1. Even though it's a simple change, it almost immediately fixed some of the issues I mentioned earlier. By having to manage multiple separate lanes, the player is constantly engaged with building their defense multiple times over, and adjusting their strategy to the varying intensity of the waves. This also adds to the complexity of the game, as new players can easily just default to making a solid defensive wall, while pros can optimize the game by making abominations. Cross-lane plants, including insta-kills,
yeah, that's what I would have did.
also give a deceptive amount of depth into how players can form their strategies. Splitting each world into levels also helps the pacing of the game. Even though some levels are really long, most of them end by the time the player becomes borderline invincible, freeing the board for new strategies with new plants before it gets boring. All of this is without mentioning how gimmicks are introduced to keep levels from playing the same. Night stages, the rooftop, and the pool all have mechanics which change the viability of certain plants, forcing players to branch out their strategies. That being said, no game is perfect. The beginning of certain stages can drag, levels can be too easy for their own good, and I am convinced that this thing is closer to a war crime than a plant, but these problems are all relatively minor, considering the dev team had no priors to build off of. They would get that chance to refine their formula with the sequel, PvZ3. Even though it certainly wasn't as innovative as the first, it managed to push the ideas of the base game to their limits. Most of the time for the best, but it did fall short in a few ways. Let's start with the positives. They kept the same basic design of having 5 lanes, but changed the gimmick stages of the original to gimmick worlds. Night levels come back in the form of Dark Ages, Lost City has sunflower tiles, the Wild West has minecarts, Big Wave Beach has low tide, and that's just to name a few. On top of that, there are tons of unique zombies for each world, like the Prospector who can jump to your back line, or the Octo Zombie who can make you stop playing the game. PvZ2 also has a generally faster pace, with a quicker early game, if you don't stall, and more condensed waves of zombies. Even the sun orbs that you use to buy plants drop more frequently and give 50 sun instead of 25. There are a few instances where I think stages could afford to be longer, but generally the quicker pace is a good change that keeps things engaging. Speaking of engagement, not every level is built the same. Spread throughout each world are minigame stages. These were in the first as well, I just chose to bring them up now since the execution is near identical. Take Walnut and Bulb Bowling. Aside from the new coat of paint, the only change is just like the difference between candle and duckpin bowling. really niche because no one cares about that sport. There's also Vase Breaker, where the player breaks vases for either a plant that they can place or it spawns a zombie. And Last Stand, which gives the player a ton of sun and the ability to plant as many plants as they can before any zombies show up. But that's the only setup they could do.
Hi guys. Oh, stop it. Stop, please. I just wanted to say hi. Sorry.
There are tons of other minigames that came back from the original, and even more new ones, like Locked and Loaded, where the player is given a set of plants that they have to use. Some minigames are a hell of a lot better than others, but hey, it's also a good idea to break up the monotony. Plus, who am I to pass up on a good game of plants versus standard agricultural practices? Not all editions were so well received though. One of the most aggressively hated editions is that of the freemium and premium plants. Freemium plants are a group of plants that can only be unlocked by spending the gems that you earn from playing the game. To get even a few of them, you need a lot of hard work, dedication, and a large disposable income. That's especially the case for the premium, since you straight up have to buy them. An arguably even worse system is that of leveling. By spending coins and seed packets, the player can level up their plants, which increases their base stats and sometimes even gives them busted special effects. This completely fails on two levels. For one, seed packets aren't exactly common, and split between the massive cast of plants, it's incredibly difficult to level up any plant, much less the ones you actually plan on using. Plus, even if you did get lucky enough to level up one of your favorite plants a bunch, it might actually be worse for you because of the other problem, balancing. Take Peashooter, for example. At level 1, it has a recharge time of 5 seconds, a sun cost of 100, and does 20 damage per shot. It's nothing exceptional, just a solid, low-effort choice that can carry you through most of the early game. At level 20, it has a recharge time of 2.5 seconds, a sun cost of 25, and does 110 damage per shot. Jesus Christ, I thought I was planting pea shooters, not pea gangbangers. This is so busted that if you get lucky enough to upgrade one plant to max, it could carry you through the entire game, while every other option becomes useless, effectively giving the player less real options. Even if you don't upgrade all the way, plants like Bowling Bulb go from okay to good in 3 levels, and become one of the best in the game at level 7. This is an especially pronounced problem because the developers had to balance the game around having level 1 plants, since upgrades are so hard to get, making the prospect of even a few levels super deadly. Really, the only way levels have a chance at working is if you're the type of person to enjoy spending hours grinding and optimizing your stats, like the even worse kind of people on Overwatch. Overall, this was a decent attempt, but failed, because the leveling system made the game way too easy and limited plant diversity. The plus side is, it's always there if you need help, and if you don't, you can always just ignore the system entirely so it doesn't drag down the game. Despite the growing pains, I consider PvZ2 a direct upgrade to the first game, with more stages, plants, gimmicks, and the emphasis on faster combat as opposed to the OG's longer stages. The best part is, it does all that without straying too far from the feel of the original game. Now, with all that out of the way, let's bring it back to the main focus of this video, PvZ3. Welcome to Zomburbia. Let's get the obvious out of the way first, since I know everyone is thinking about it. This art style employs a very similar strategy to the likes of Dr. Disrespect, trying to appeal to as many minors as possible. Personally, I don't like it. It's messy, annoying to look at, and frankly a pain, but hey, that's why I don't plan on having kids anyway. For real though, I won't drag on the corporate art style too hard since Suburbia has gentrified worse than a pea shooter. Now let's dig into the real changes. Keeping with the theme, I'm gonna start with the stuff I like. For the first time in the series, we have more than one human character with the addition of Patrice. She's actually pretty chill and a welcome addition to the cast. The story also plays a larger role in the game, and the player can interact both with the characters more through dialogue and with the environment in the form of decorations. I had low expectations for something like this since it's literally never been done in the series before, but it's actually pretty fun. With that being said, I really wanted to make the upside sections longer to be fair to the game, but if I'm being honest, the story is the only real upside. So let's break down just how much worse this game can get.
I don't know how my head got like this.
The most obvious offense to me is in the plant and enemy variety. For context, PvZ1 has just under 50 plants. PvZ2 has nearly 200 plants, with almost half of them being usable. PvZ3 just reached 19 plants after 7 years of development, and 2, arguably 3 of them, barely do anything. If that wasn't bad enough, there's also barely any enemy diversity. I really don't want to have to break down the numbers for every point, but I have to mention that PvZ3 only has 9 unique enemies. Meanwhile, I couldn't even count how many are in PvZ2 because the website's page can't even load them all. Just comparing the first few levels, this difference is obvious, with the most interesting PvZ3 character having the unique skill of walking left, while the first section of PvZ2 has pharaohs that steal your sun, mummies that spawn graves as obstacles, and camel zombies that use panels to protect their groups. Speaking of levels, they're even shorter in this game, oftentimes finishing before you even have more than 2 lines of plants, sometimes even being over before you could fill 1 lane. Remember how I mentioned that PvZ2 had a faster early game and ended quicker than PvZ1 to avoid dragging on? PvZ3 is just the early game, with all the boredom of building a defense from scratch and none of the coolness of watching a complete defense tear through massive hordes. Premiums aren't in the game, but purchasable power-ups are, and I've seen a few people complain that they're straight up necessary for some levels. There's also a life system, which means that if you lose too much, you have to wait to play the game again or pay real money. You also can't play levels again once you beat them.
Good joke. But I don't like jokes.
And the worst part is, until recently, there was no reason to replay levels because you couldn't even choose your plants. That's right, for a vast majority of the time this game has been out, you couldn't even pick which plants you wanted to use. Thankfully, PopCap added that option pretty recently, but it doesn't make a huge difference since levels were designed to use certain plants, and let's be honest, there are hardly many options to pick from. Bringing this back into the broader picture, PvZ1 was innovative to the tower defense genre as a whole. PvZ2 took most of the features introduced in the first to the next level, and massively expanded the idea of what Plants vs. Zombies could do. PvZ3 seemed to roll back all of that to commit the worst crime a game ever could. Just be kind of boring. I'd love to end this on some big reveal of corporate espionage or some crazy experimental change that blew up the game, but it really is as simple as stripping back on the characters, enemies, gimmicks, and stage time. Doesn't really leave a whole lot left to enjoy, especially when you compare it to the previous games. Opinions were already bad because they released a horrible beta version, didn't really listen to fan feedback, and haven't done anything to make players want to give the game a second chance. Could you blame EA for not advertising it much? Hell, what would they even advertise? A bad beta that has been publicly dragged towards release for the last 4 years? Still, it's not all that bad. I know if you're watching this video, you're probably fiending for some quality plant content. Well, stop your shaking and lock in, because being hooked on some weed's nothing compared to this simple trick you can do right now, just by stepping outside. It's this little thing called heroin. Please like and subscribe, please! Please watch all my videos. I want money. I need money to buy things. Okay, goodbye.